Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. I am Jane Hauser. I'm the Director of Marketing and Outreach for NESCA, and I am joined by Dr. Sophie Bellenis, and she is NESCA's occupational therapist and real life skills coach and program manager. So thank you again for joining us. I know things can be tricky these days to join these join webinars and such. We will be talking today about talking with our children about sexuality and teens with disabilities. We'll also be featuring a Q&A at the end of the webinar, so please hold all questions till the end. You can type in your questions in the Q&A feature. We've enabled that for you. And please only use the chat for any kind of technical difficulties or questions that you have along the way. So thanks again for joining us, and with that, I will turn it over to Sophie Bellenis.
Thank you so much, Jane. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so glad and grateful to you all for being here. I'm really excited to delve into this topic today. I think it's hugely important and often underexplored. And I echo Jane's gratitude that you're all here and sitting with something that might be a little bit of an uncomfortable topic. So as Jane said, my name is Sophie Bellenis. I'm an occupational therapist here at NESCA. In the past, I've worked in schools with ages preschool through post-secondary. I've worked in social pragmatics program for teenagers and done quite a few social skills groups sort of focused on this age group. And one thing that consistently comes up is sexual health education, sexuality, navigating all different aspects of this topic. So it's inherently difficult to navigate, and there's a lot that goes into it. So let's get started. I'm going to share my screen with all of you, and we will have access to a PowerPoint presentation here. So everybody should be able to see it. We are going to be focusing on sexual health education for teens with disabilities and this process of talking about this topic with them. So today we're going to start off by examining the barriers to and the need for talking about sexuality. Essentially, why is this important? We're going to review typical human sexual development. We are going to discuss values and ethics and how this plays a role in this type of education. Obviously, this is something that's incredibly personal to individuals and families and often communities. So we'll review that a little bit. We're gonna review consent, both giving consent and appropriately receiving consent. We will define the role of parents in this whole process, and then at the end, we will really focus on acquiring and practicing some skills and strategies for communicating about sexuality. So figuring out specific ways to answer questions, to use teachable moments. So let's get started. So why is this important? I hear three big myths pretty frequently when I'm talking to parents or administrators or people who are a little bit hesitant about engaging in this conversation. And these are the three things that I tend to hear. The education is teaching teens to have sex. Sexuality education teaches someone else's values about sexuality. And if we talk about it, then they will do it. I wanted to just make it clear that these are not true. Sexuality education is teaching children and adolescents, teens, how to safely have sex, how to make safe decisions. It teaches them the values of their parents, and it helps them figure out their own personal values. And there's no correlation between an increase in sexual activity and an increase in education. It's actually the opposite. We tend to see students making healthier choices when they are better educated. That being said, this is a difficult topic, and there's many different reasons why this is difficult for parents to kind of engage and initiate talking about. I have a few of them listed here. The first one is the no role models. The reality is that sexual health education has been lacking across the board for decades at this point, and often parents don't feel like they received comprehensive sex education and they don't have a model to follow. It's less of a, this is how I learned it and that was great, and so I'll teach it to my children this way. It's more, I don't really remember how I learned it and it didn't seem comprehensive, so I don't know where to start. Another one is the messages we've received ourselves about how to talk about this and whether it's appropriate to talk about this. Honestly, the most common thing that I hear is just, I don't know how, which is completely fair. There's little guidance unless you're really searching for it. It's embarrassing. We don't know what's too much. We don't know what's too little. No one ever talked to us about it. There are often negative messages about these discussions. And I think that I hear parents saying that they feel their children will come into it with a really negative preconception, which leads them to feel uncomfortable getting started. Not knowing the answers, and again, just worried that it will, quote, give them ideas. It's that whole, if we teach them about it, they will do it. That's what I tend to hear, and this is what I'd like to counter it with. So why is it so important to talk about sexuality? Like I mentioned before, there's limited sexuality education in most schools. I'm not saying that no schools do it well or that no districts are really focusing on this and prioritizing this, but across the US, there is a reality that there is limited information and most schools are not doing it particularly well. So this kind of falls on both lists. We don't know how to do it, but it's important to do it because no one's really doing it. The next is to combat unhealthy messages from the culture. We see so much in television, on the internet, on social media, all over that has really negative and often incorrect messages, and often really unhealthy. You know, there's a lot of information about relationships that might start really young or relationships that might not have great examples of giving consent. See in shows. So we want to be able to combat that and provide more accurate information. Talking about it normalizes the topic and makes children feel heard. It shows that you're open and kids can trust you. A big one is that it's this opportunity to express your values and explain how you view this topic. It increases sexual health, and like I mentioned, it reduces sexual abuse when children are accurately educated on this topic. Just as an example, here are some specific quotes from adolescents who have received some comprehensive sexual education. I'll read a few of them. So we can learn to have healthy relationships because we all have needs and desires, and that's okay. That's a big one I hear from students. It's like, I have these things, I always knew I felt this way, and now I've learned that that's okay. And that's a pretty big piece of acceptance. For help with the toughest part of the relationship, making it last. So it's, again, relationship and sexuality focused. Just so that we aren't lonely. This is my favorite one. It's so I remember not to talk about my dates with my bus driver. And so that we can be sexual self-advocates, not just self-advocates. And that really is the goal. The ability for adolescents to, and this is just a kind of comprehensive definition of what sexual health means. It means feeling good about and understanding our bodies, feeling good about who we are and having high self-esteem, feeling good about gender identity and sexual orientation, having relationships that are positive, pleasurable, and not exploitative, having information to make healthy decisions and health decisions, and avoiding STIs, unintended pregnancy, and other challenges. So this is the goal. Confidence, feeling good, understanding both the factual information and a student's personal values, and then being safe and being helpful and being able to do this in an educated manner. So I'm going to start us off by sort of getting all on the same page about human sexual development. Human sexual development consists of the physical and emotional changes of puberty, the development of sexual orientation, and often gender identity goes with that behavior, and then eventually the development of a sexual identity. So this is the progression that all adults or children going through adulthood are developing. They're experiencing all of those. They're experiencing them at different times, but they are universal. They do kind of span the lifespan for most individuals. I'll start with child human sexual development. This is stuff that most parents have already seen, and often it's less personal. It happens more overtly because children often have less of a filter, so they're just kind of going to ask the questions without thinking twice. So children are starting to learn their body parts and functions. There's often genital touching. They'll explore. They're figuring out. They might notice with a sibling that they look different. They're figuring out their role as male and female. They are developing a sense of body image. They're starting to make decisions about how they've noticed things that they like and maybe they dislike. A need for privacy generally naturally increases. Children who are 2 have really no view of that, but when they're starting to get like 8, 9, or 10, they might be really wanting to change in a separate room. They might want to be more hidden. They might want to have more things to cover themselves up. And they're going to ask some pretty basic questions. They might say, just where do I come from? How are babies made? And often parents just feel more equipped to answer these questions at this age. With our next slide, the first thing I've probably noticed is how many more, and that's because adolescence is just a huge explosion of sexual development. There are tons of physical changes. There are pimples, there's body odor, there's body hair, there's females getting their period. There's all sorts of things happening that kids are figuring out. There's also a huge change in friendships. Middle school tends to be a time when social groups are shifting and people are figuring out more of an identity that plays a role in their friendships and working through all of that. Sexual feelings start, masturbation starts. Well, sometimes that starts younger. Again, it's also individualized. But one thing that really does kind of start to universally at this adolescent age is the establishing and maintaining intimate relationships. Adolescents are figuring out how to navigate expressing affection, how to communicate through all aspects of this topic, how to decide when they're ready to have sex, how to figure out giving and receiving pleasure, and then a big one is figuring out breaking up, because lots of these students are exploring and figuring out who they want to be with, who they like, what makes them happy. So this is what I consider to be the most important slide in the whole presentation. And I really feel like if we could get this fact to be universally understood, we'd be starting in a much better place. So I'll read it. And that's that adolescents with disabilities are not young children, even though they are often viewed this way by members of the community. Despite this, sexual health education does not necessarily look the same as it does for their peers. So I think the first part's really big. There are a lot of internalized messages that we throw at students, especially with disabilities. The idea that they're not sexual beings, the idea that they should not have sex, or that sex is something that's really dangerous and taboo. The idea that they're innocent and very childlike and need protection. The idea that they're not responsible and they can't problem solve. The idea that they're unable to make good decisions about sexuality. These are all things that, as a culture, we tend, reality, are not accurate. Our children with disabilities have many different ways that they can engage in this. They are much better decision makers than we often give them credit for when they're provided with sufficient and adequate information. We tend to think that they will make mistakes as a culture, and I would like to counter that and say that these are often adolescents and adults who are perfectly capable of making decisions that are right for them when they are provided with support. So what this really highlights is that lots of aspects about sexuality are the same, but lots are different, and a lot of that is how it's taught. So next, I'd just like to review some of the things that are the same and some of the things that are going to look pretty different. Some of the things that are the same is that children have an assigned gender at birth, that gender roles are culturally reinforced, that they will experience biological changes as they grow from 0 to 20 and beyond. They're going to experience some really biological, physical changes. They need the same information, and that needs to be based on biological age. They have sexual feelings and needs, and they have dreams like anyone else. They have dreams about relationships, about dating, about marriage, about maybe having a family one day, and you'll often hear that. I think almost all children talk about these things, and that's definitely the same. One I really want to kind of hone in on is this need for age-appropriate information. There are times in a student's academic career when they need to be taught different information than their same aged peers, when they need to be given information at a different level, at a different at their cognitive age, maybe, where they're learning something behind their peers. This is not a topic that can be taught in that way. Their bodies are developing and changing at the same pace and at the same rate as the majority of their peers. Obviously, there are exceptions, everyone's different, but they need to have information that is related to their biological age and where they are specifically on development, in physical and emotional development. So this is one that I really think is important to focus on. If your son or daughter is 11 years old, they should be being taught the same information as the other 11-year-olds in their class. Not necessarily in the same way, but the data needs to be accurate and age appropriate. The fact that students are figuring out their sexual orientation and gender identity is the same. Sexual orientation is who a person is romantically, erotically, affectionately attracted to. And gender identity is your sense of self, male, female, gender nonconforming. All our students are figuring out where they lie on those spectrums. There's also a lot that's different. There's often a lack of basic sexual information and skills. The nature of the disability really plays a role. So, I'm using this term disability quite broadly, but within that, there are obviously specific diagnoses who respond and learn this information very differently. And some of those mean that they don't pick up on social cues, or they need additional topics covered, or they have trouble identifying emotions they're feeling in the moment, or even in hindsight. There's sometimes a lack of friendships and social opportunities. They sometimes miss informal learning. I like to refer to this informal learning as hallway learning. Just kind of listening to what's going on in the hallways, jokes being made between classes, people starting rumors about classmates, which is unfortunate, but which students are all hearing and all learning through. This is a double-edged sword. I think we all know that middle schoolers, for example, don't necessarily have all perfectly accurate information about sexual health. So while our students with disabilities might not be missing inaccurate information, they might be missing some accurate information. They might be missing terminology that's used within their peer groups. They might be missing some of that, just kind of the hallway learning stuff. We often have different expectations regarding behaviors, and we accept and forgive certain things. And I want to talk about that a little bit more, because what I'm referencing is this propensity for people in our culture to really quickly forgive students or adolescents with disabilities for doing something that might be inappropriate. And they might say, oh, it's no big deal. Don't worry about it. I know he doesn't mean anything, which is kind, but in some ways it inadvertently reinforces things that aren't necessarily beneficial. They might need somebody to say, oh, that made me feel uncomfortable. Please don't do that. I think that providing kids with accurate feedback is important, and we don't always do that for our students with disabilities. They often lack privacy to explore their sexuality. A lot of adolescents in high school might be sneaking off in cars or hiding in their bedrooms, and we don't always provide our students with disabilities and our adolescents with disabilities with the same level of privacy and ability to just kind of explore. For some students, that's a good thing, and privacy is not something they're quite ready to handle at that level. But even on a personal level, privacy to be in the bedroom by themselves and explore themselves is something to be aware of and take into account, that students do need that privacy kind of no matter what. Another thing that's different is that often parents' view of what the future will look like for their student changes, some ways accurately and some ways inaccurately, but that's definitely something to just be aware of. And sometimes parents see their children with disabilities as asexual, which they might be, but in terms of percentage, they likely are not. There are higher rates of abuse. Children with intellectual disabilities are at a 3.14 times greater risk of sexual abuse. And, the best way to combat this is with education. How you teach the topics may be different, and they also may have a wide range of abilities that are greater than their peers or limitations that make it more difficult than their peers. One specific thing that I always kind of find important to note is the autism and sexuality. Autistic people are 7 times more likely to be gender nonconforming than the general population. And at gender clinics, it's 10 times more likely that the participants have a diagnosis of autism than the general population. So this is also called being a double rainbow, being on the spectrum and being part of the LGBTQIA+ community. So, autism does not imply asexuality or hypersexuality. This can also often be seen as a really cool thing. There's a great community, and I did put a link there to twainbow.org, and that is specifically for adolescents, adults, children who identify as having both of these as part of their identity, being on the autism spectrum and being part of the LGBTQIA community. So I wanted to just kind of note that one. The next thing I'm going to talk about is values and ethics. These are really important and individual, and it makes it difficult and a little bit scary to have somebody else teaching such sexual education to your children. They're very specific to families, they're very specific to communities and individuals. And one thing I want to say is that as somebody who has worked to teach this information and disseminate this information, my role is absolutely factually based. So I know that professionals working in this field work very hard and very intentionally to only provide factual data and information and answer questions in context, but with facts, not opinions or values. So teaching values just isn't part of school-based sexual health, and it shouldn't be. As I said, they're very different, they're very personal, and I do want to note that sometimes we have very different values than our parents. I know that that's the case for many of the people in my life. We just view things differently as things shift culturally or as things shift within family systems. It's important to explain your values, but your children may not have the same values that you do. That being said, I think it's really important to consider 3 universal values, and these are: 1, it's important to respect others by treating them well and listening to them. 2, it's important to get consent from a sweetheart before being sexual. I use the term sweetheart mostly because it's non-gendered, and I've found that to be a good tool, especially if you're made up their mind about their sexuality or haven't, or if you just don't want to make assumptions. And relationships should be equal and positive without violence or abuse. So it might seem like these are kind of simple and basic, but a lot goes into them. The main thing I want to talk about is consent. Consent is really abstract, especially if it's not properly defined. That being said, the definition of consent seems to change as a society. We sort of update our understanding this topic. We update our understanding of how people feel in situations. We update our understanding of power dynamics. We update our understanding of how well people can communicate in certain situations. So it's amorphous and it's tough, but it's important to really focus in on. We must teach adolescents to both give and to get consent. This is something that is not often explicitly taught, both giving and receiving consent. And it's often something that needs to be explicitly taught. Does not apply to everyone, but some children and adolescents with disabilities have been taught that their instincts are, quote, wrong. And what I mean by that is that some of the programming that we have for students is to help them be comfortable in situations that are uncomfortable for them. An example I tend to use is a pep rally. Some of our students with disabilities do not enjoy crowds and loud noises and things like that. And it might be part of their goal for the day to make it a pep rally afterwards, for making it through a pep rally and, you know, using some strategies they've learned to deal with the sensory overload, or advocating for themselves politely when they really need to leave. And so what this does do is it shows our students that in some cases, going against your instincts is a good thing, and you'll be praised for putting up with a certain level of discomfort. And the reality is that consent is truly about comfort and trust, and that is something that I find really needs to be highlighted. Students who have had that approach, who have had the approach of really trying to push through uncomfortable experiences, it's important to make it clear that this does not apply in sexual experiences and in sexual relationships. It's important to emphasize that anyone can change their mind at any time throughout the process, and that that is okay and needs to be respected. I included a slide here that was created by Planned Parenthood. I don't necessarily think it's the only way to teach consent, but I do think it's a good way to focus on specific things we can tell adolescents. So it's ongoing. Anyone can change their mind. It's freely given. There can't be any pressure, any manipulation, any bargaining. It's very specific. Because somebody says, yes, you can kiss me, doesn't mean that they want to do anything formed. There's nobody being tricked in any way. And I like this one at the end. It's enthusiastic. It should be given with sort of enthusiasm and excitement. Sort of moving past that, sex education should really be coupled with relationship curriculums or friendship curriculums that focus on helping our students understand how there's a hierarchy of relationships, sort of what a relationship, how one can progress to the other. So it really needs to be put in context. I like to mention that while, you know, something like a sexual health focused goal isn't generally part of something like an IEP or a special ed curriculum, it could be a good idea to ask for something more specific, like an intimacy and relationships curriculum being part of those documents or part of that educational component. Within sexual education itself, because with intimacy and relationships, things just are less factually based. You're not teaching specific information, you're teaching how to interact with others, which is really complicated, but they really should be hand in hand. They really go together. And so I would just like to point out here, like, our kids are always taking in information, and they need to figure out how to figure out what is fact and what is fiction. And putting sexual health education within a comprehensive curriculum helps them to examples. School systems tend to sort of focus on one example or one type of curriculum, but here are two pretty solid examples of ones that I've seen a lot in schools that have been well received and that really help students to figure out where the people in their life lie in relationship to them socially and intimately. So now we'll move on to sort of the specific tips and the specific strategies. This is where we'll talk about sort of what parents can do and what parents' roles are. So the role of a parent is to provide accurate information, to listen, be an outlet, to model, to show how people should be communicating, to support, and that's just, support through specific situations and give advice as you can, to answer questions honestly. And I think it's really important to respond in a positive way about sexuality. Not being shocked by questions or not being notably uncomfortable, or at least not showing that you're notably uncomfortable during a conversation. So here are some specific tools. I think that this tends to be the case with all children, but I would say more specifically for students with disabilities is that you may have to initiate. You may have to start the conversation, and there's a good chance people won't be asking. I suggest using inclusive language. The example I gave earlier of using the term sweetheart, as it's not gendered, is just a good example of just using inclusive language, making it seem, are you dating anyone? Are you interested in anybody at school? As opposed to, are you interested in a specific girl at school? Something like that. It's okay to feel embarrassed and not know the answer, and answer a question later. This is I didn't know what to say, so I just said this. And often they come up with the perfect thing. Parents know their kids best. But it really is okay to say, I'm not sure. I'd like to figure that out and get back to you. Using a private tone in a private place. So that's sort of part of the modeling. Our children and adolescents, they take their cues from us. And so if you're talking about sexual health or sexuality really loudly at a restaurant, they're not learning that that's not how you should be discussing these things. So just making sure to lower your voice, talk about it privately, and not in a way that makes them embarrassed, but just in a way that makes it clear that this is sort of a social topic that we talk about quietly to ourselves. Give age-appropriate information. We talked about this before, but it's really important to stick to biological age. Use models, visuals, TV, role plays, and scenarios. So I think this is one of the most important tips and tools, because I find that parents often feel, and they need to be giving all the information, they need to be having these really in-depth conversations where they where they answer all the questions. And I don't find that to be the case. I find that as long as parents are previewing and disseminating resources that they trust and that they find really does align with their values and ethics, then that can be one of the best ways to teach this information. Just because you can explain what consent is doesn't mean that it wouldn't be better presented in the form of a video or in the form of pictures or graphics that you can show to a student. You sort of need to be the disseminator of information, but it doesn't necessarily have to be conversation-based. Try to give a consistent message. Try not to react, try not to act like it's this huge, uncomfortable topic. And then use teachable moments. So when answering questions, teachable moments sort of consists of these 5 guidelines. Reassuring the person that it's good to ask questions. So you're just saying, oh my gosh, I'm so glad that you came to me with that. What an interesting thing for you to be thinking about. I'm glad that we're going to chat about it. Finding out what the person thinks and is really asking. So sometimes our students might say, Mom, when did you have sex for the first time? But whether you think maybe they're ready to have sex for the first time, or maybe whether they think that they're of an age that their friends might be having sex. And they're trying to figure out a way to ask it that they're comfortable with. Decide what message you want to give. So, be really clear with what you're trying to impart. Answer questions simply using medical terminology. I had a student once in a group of mine who was masturbating during our group, and I spoke to his father and I asked if he had had any information or if he'd had any sexual health education around this topic. He was a student with a disability, and the father said, well, we do tell him to do his man things in a private place. And while this father was, really trying to do his best for his son and teach him how to be appropriate, his choice to not say, yes, we've taught him about masturbation, we've told him that he should only be touching his genitals in a bedroom or somewhere private, it really muddies the water, and it makes it a little bit more uncomfortable and a little bit more unclear, because I don't think that the student necessarily always knows what they're being instructed to do. Using medical terminology really takes the gray away. That can make it really black and white. And then the last thing is just encouraging the person to give feedback, saying, well, what do you think? How do you feel about that? Is there anything else you wanted to ask me? These are all things that I think our students love to hear from their parents. And then in terms of behaviors, we can also use this teachable moments theory. We need to decide first whether it's better to ignore the situation. And again, only parents will know that. It's a judgment call, and parents know their kids best. So sometimes things are done for attention, and if it's better to just ignore, that's the best way to go about it. I think the next thing is to name the behavior and maybe just acknowledge the fact that it's being noticed. I've worked with some students, mostly all at the middle school age, where they may be touching themselves over their pants, and they'll say, well, I didn't know that anybody could tell. And that's a valid confusion. That's like a valid missing of information. And I think it's important to say, like, oh, I see that you're doing that, and I think that other people can see that you're doing that. And that might be enough to just kind of teach in the moment. Finding out the meaning behind the behavior or comment. We spoke about that a little bit before, like what are they really trying to learn or get at? And then again, decide the messages you want to give messages by being simple and responding really concretely. And then again, encourage feedback. Try and really come to a shared understanding. So the last sort of tip I want to talk about is the Scarborough method. I think that this is a tool used both for sexual health education and for education on other topics, because it puts things in context, and I think that's really, really huge. So the Scarborough method is a way to respond to a factual question, and it's making sure that you're covering 3 separate sort of domains or ways to look at it. So the first is physical, and that's just very concretely answering the question. This is what most people would say when asked a question. So, for example, what's a seatbelt? Somebody would say a seatbelt is a piece of a belt that straps you to your chair in the car. And that is your physical description. It buckles into the seat below and it keeps you safe. A social response, and that's more, is it something that needs to be done in private? What is the responsibility? Are there laws? So if we're using that seatbelt example, you would say it's illegal in the state of Massachusetts to not wear a seatbelt while you're driving. this results in a fine if you decide not to use a seatbelt, and it's really unsafe. And then emotional is the feeling connected to it. Is it different for everyone? And there's a lot of ways you could go with that. If we're continuing with the seatbelt example, you could say, most people feel proud when they wear their seatbelt because they're making a good decision. Most parents feel safe when they strap their children into their seatbelts because they know that if something happened, everybody is at a much better chance of being okay afterwards. And so you want to touch on all of these things, and this is especially important with sexual health because things aren't naturally put in context for our students. So I have a couple examples here of using the Scarborough method for questions that may be asked about sexual health education. So the first one is, what is a condom? And a physical answer to an adolescent could be, a condom is something like a rubber sock that covers the penis. It can prevent pregnancy and STIs. So it's just defining exactly what it is. You want to move on to social. Using a condom is private. So you could say it's something that's done privately. It protects you and your partner. And then emotional. Many people feel good when they're using them because they're protecting themselves and their partner. So people feel, you could say people feel proud, people feel responsible, people feel like they're making a good decision, making good choices. And it really gives this comprehensive definition that not only makes it so that they can tell you what it is, they can tell you what it's used for, why it's used, and how it might make people feel. Another one that I've used it for a lot is, what does having your period mean? And that's just a slang terminology. There's no context there, and there's no way that students would understand what that means based on context clues. It's not something that you could just figure out. So you could say, having your period is a nickname for menstruation. It's when blood drips out of the vagina. So very medical terminology. Obviously, we could go into a more comprehensive definition here if that's what a student was looking for. Maybe if a female student was really trying to understand why that was something that their body did every month. Social, it's normal for this to happen. It generally happens once a month for females, and it's generally handled privately in the bathroom. It's something that girls and women do independently, and they might need a little help taking care of it, but it's something that you do in private. And emotional, a person can feel grumpy, crampy, or tired during menstruation. Some people may feel embarrassed, but having a period is completely normal. Another one I've added before is, it's something that some women feel proud of because they are proud of being a woman. And that might not be true for everyone, but for some people it is. And I think it's a good way to add it in there. This is also a way to put your personal and family values into an answer for a question. That social and that emotional piece is very personal, and you can choose to touch on those however you want to. I just think it's a great strategy. I've ended up, since I learned about the Scarborough method, I've used it over and over again to make sure I'm giving really comprehensive definitions. I think it's a fabulous tool. So, also really quickly, one suggestion, I was working with another professional, and what we started doing was coming up with questions for each other and then making the other person answer it using the Scarborough method, and it helped us get really good at this. And so I've given this recommendation to either, if there are two parents in a home, if there's a mom and her sister who want to practice, but asking each other questions and having you use this method to answer it helps you get good at it and be prepared when inevitably an adolescent or a child comes up with a question and you're like, oh, physical, social, emotional. Make sure we touch on them. So that can be good practice. So the last thing I kind of want to focus in on are some resources that I find to be really comprehensive and give great information. I'm going to stop screen sharing this, and I'm going to go to one of these quickly. But I'll redo this screen share. and I have it. Here we go. So this is amaze.org, and I like showing this because I referenced the fact that we don't necessarily have to be kind of this fountain of knowledge. We can help to disseminate information. And I have found that amaze.org and all the videos that they provide can be a great way, and they often have lots of videos on the same topic. So for example, puberty. If you click on this one and you go down, there's all different videos. They're not all the same animation. They're not all the same creators, but they're all kind of focused on puberty. And you could find, you know, here's 1, 2, 3 videos that sort of focus on menstruation. And you can watch them all and see which one might make the most sense for your child. Another one that I think is great to highlight is within healthy relationships. They have lots of different videos on consent. And like we talked about, this is a really hard topic to cover. So some of these you can go in and you could watch, you know, you could watch saying yes or no, what is consent? You could watch all sorts of different videos and find the ones that you think, like maybe this one about hockey would speak to your child about consent. You can really find the ones that you think give accurate information that align with your values and that you think your child would respond to. So I do think that this is a great tool, especially if your child is going to benefit from sort of that multisensory aspect, the ability to watch it happening. If you think they'd benefit from seeing it and hearing it at the same time. So there's all sorts of categories: puberty, sexual orientation, gender identity, personal safety. So I just wanted to kind of highlight this resource because I think that it really can provide families with some great options when they're looking for places to go. The other 2 resources that I have shared, I will go back to. Respectability has compiled different resources under categories, and some of them are also under specific disabilities. So it might be like talking to your child with Down syndrome about masturbation, and that can be really helpful, especially if you're looking for something for a specific diagnosis. And you know, not all diagnoses, but some diagnoses have students who learn in a relatively specific way, and that comes from educators and families who have found things that work for those children specifically. So I find that to be really helpful. It also has things broken out by category in terms of hygiene, masturbation, reproductive health. So that can be great because you can think like, do I want to go disability specific? Do I want to go topic specific? So I put that in there. And then the last one is a Planned Parenthood resource that focuses on age-appropriate tips, and that looks at kind of preschool age, early elementary school, and that goes through adulthood. And I like that because, as we discussed, it's so important to focus on really age-appropriate information, and it's not really fair to assume that everyone knows what that is, you know? So if you're looking for sort of a biological age reference about what most children are learning at that age, I think that gives a nice outline, as well as some nice resources. But I think that can really teach parents sort of specifically where to focus at each age and what is being covered for most students at those points in sort of their academic career. So I think that is it for today. I know that we are having a Q&A. So I am happy to talk about anything specific. I'm not sure if anyone has questions yet. Let's see. Jane, are you there? Well, I'm happy to, oh, I see one coming in. Okay. By what age do we need to start talking about sexual health with our students? So I think that's a great question, and I think that I'm a big proponent of sort of following the biological guidelines that are out there on Planned Parenthood. They talk a little bit about sort of what's appropriate even for a preschool age. You know, this is information that can be covered starting really young. You know, you're not necessarily talking about the things I mentioned before, like what is a condom or what does having your period mean, but you are starting to help students figure out sort of what's their sexual identity, what's their sexual orientation, where do babies come from is really the first question that tends to come up. I found that really is kind of where the conversation begins, because it's sort of the question that most young children are going to ask. So I think it's, you know, it's part of a progression. You're not necessarily talking about specifically sexual health really young, but you might be starting to introduce the terminology. You might be starting to model healthy relationships in your life, and kind of, you don't want to jump right in at 11 or 12 for the first time using this and having to teach all these things, but you may want to build more slowly and be able to kind of introduce terminology, helps kids figure out things slowly. The next question I see here is, do you have any concrete example on how to teach kids with disabilities who are nonverbal? I have worked with lots of kids who are nonverbal and had to cover lots of these topics, and I have really found that using videos and using visuals is the way to go. I think it's really important to focus on making sure things are understood and making sure that they're understanding what they're learning. So if there's any way to sort of follow up and you say, like, have not like a quiz, but have a, you know, a question with 3 options and make sure they're learning. But videos have really been the way that I've seen the most comprehensive knowledge kind of resonate with students who are nonverbal. I'm going to read the next question. How do we bring different cultural values into teaching kids with disability on sex? Because it's a very sensitive topic, and that parents of teens with disabilities do not think that their children will engage in any sexual issues due to their intellectual disability, or that they will not go out, so sex education might not be necessary. That's another great question. You know, I think I talked about that a little bit at the beginning by saying that really all people have a sexual identity at some level. The cultural aspect is really important to engage families in the process. And I think that parents have the opportunity to teach their values and their ethics and what they view on everything, but students are also going to hear things from the culture where they're living. You know, there's media all around us that gives us ideas about these things. And so I hope I'm answering your question, but I think it's just really important to focus on the fact that all people are sexual beings, whether or not they're going to end up engaging in sexual relationships with others. It's going to be something that is on their mind and they're thinking about as they're going through the same hormonal and developmental changes of puberty and things like that. So that's what I tend to say, but the cultural piece tends to come from involving the family. My son's high school program says they don't teach sexual health curriculums for any students. Where can I go to get help with this if he's not getting it at school and he does not want to hear it from me? So that's a great question. I would recommend those 3 resources I put at the end. I think that the amaze.org site is great. It has really good information. If your student is not somebody who's going to enjoy videos, the last thing that I had on there, which is the Respectability, has some great concrete resources for students to read. And that's really targeting all different levels. If you want to look into that, there's some great online websites. There are some books they recommend. There's all sorts of things. There's articles. And I think Planned Parenthood, also that site, has some great just concrete information, not values driven, but definitely information that's helpful. Do you have any materials on sexual education in other languages that you can share? I do not specifically have them right now. If you'd like to reach out to me, my email is on our NESCA website, and if you tell me the language, I can kind of reach out to my network and see if there's anything specific that would be helpful. But kind of off the top of my head, I don't have translated sources. What about classes or indirect or direct instruction? Do you teach classes? I'm not currently teaching classes. However, I have run groups in the past focused on sexual health education. I don't know of any right now, but again, if you reach out, it's definitely a conversation I'd be interested in continuing. And I am working with a couple students on some one-on-one answering questions and helping navigate sort of some of this process. Can you please provide your contact information, contact again here? Jane, should I type that in here?
Type that in over on the chat wall. We'll also be sending a note out to all attendees, and we'll include a link to the replay of this as well in that note too.
Fabulous. So this is my email, and I can be reached there at any time. Oh, is there a dash? Is that wrong, Jane?
I'll put it right back up. There we go.
Okay, sorry. I had a typo. Does anybody else have any specific questions? Again, I'm so grateful. I know that this is a topic that people often feel uncomfortable with, and I'm really grateful that people are prioritizing it and seeing their children and, you know, making it a point to find out how to give the right information. I'm impressed by everybody who chose to attend.
All right. Thanks so much, everyone, and take care and stay safe. Bye-bye.
Thank you.